Big Vibe, Stable It's your boy Black Finesse. It is about time for another set of history and knowledge on World War II, man. It's called What Happens to a Sherman Crew After a Hit. And this is from the being hit, water in the tank. Now, if from my observation, I know what happens is that once the tank gets hit, a lot of the mechanical stuff gets shut down. Now, the question is, do other members get hit in the process? I think so, because if I remember correctly, the movie Fury, one of the dudes got hit. I would expect a round from a tank to get shot right through another tank, and it probably hit one of the tank members. But other than that, I have to see what else type of damage is done to it, because all I know is it just shuts down the tank, and if you hit it more, it's just going to set on fire and pretty much burn them alive. But we're gonna see.
We've all seen photos and videos from the Second World War of burning Sherman tanks and heard all sorts of
can they make it out?
legends about them. But today, you're going to understand exactly what happened to the crews whose tank got hit in combat and why it was more disturbing than you could even imagine. But now, so you'd understand better why such horrible things happened to Sherman crews, we have to start with the idea and belief behind why this tank came into existence, after which it was immediately pushed into war. After the First World War, American tank development was basically in hibernation, with almost no attempts to come up with modern armor. By 1939, the best they had were some 400 light tanks, tied to the cavalry and called combat cars, not even tanks. These were mostly M2 series, thinly armored and tall, with no real way to fight against what other nations had. And those other nations had been doing their homework on armored doctrine. The Germans, they wanted doing exactly the opposite of the Americans. And when the war erupted, they showed how right they were with tanks spearheading their blitzkrieg attacks. The war had already shifted to North Africa by the time America wanted to join in. But by then, the best they could come up with was the rather strange M3 Lee. It was intentionally odd, you see, because they lacked the technology at the time to mount a good tank gun in a fully rotating turret. So they slapped a 75mm gun in a fixed casemate on the side of the gun, added a turret with an already outdated 37mm.
Can you outrun a tank? No, you can't. That was a dumb question.
To buy time for a new tank to be developed properly. That's how the Sherman came into play. The M4 Sherman, urgently developed in 1941, took from its older brother the M3 Lee, a reliable chassis and drivetrain, and added an all-welded hull. Riveted armor had a nasty tendency to create hypersonic shrapnel inside the tank when rivets were struck from the outside, even by non-penetrating hits. And yes, many crews were unfortunate enough to experience this firsthand. However, the Sherman now carried a 75mm gun, considered powerful enough at the time. It was designed mostly to support infantry with high explosive firepower, but it was also expected to hold its own if it met enemy tanks. As we all know today, that wasn't the Sherman's biggest. But even
I like this. He added blueprints in the videos.
That was nowhere near the problems awaiting the crews, who were confidently being shipped with their brand new tanks to Africa. They were about to meet battle-hardened German panzer units, their ingenious General Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox, and the fearsome 88mm anti-aircraft guns turned into tank killers. The first Shermans to ever see combat would actually debut in British hands, arriving just in time to cover horrific losses and to participate in the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. About 250 brand new Shermans, freshly painted in desert camouflage, reached Egypt just in time for the invasion. The British praised the Sherman's reliability. To them, it was a miracle that they could shut the engine.
Isn't that one of the fastest tanks
in the morning? Something their Crusaders and cruisers weren't quite successful at. The 75mm gun was much more appreciated than the previous 50mm on their light tanks. It could destroy Panzer IIIs and IVs, at least before the Germans upgraded their frontal armor. The Shermans were better protected as well, although far from invincible, and within weeks of the battle, the British were asking for more. But there were things they didn't like as much, like you've probably heard hundreds of times. Immediately bursting into flames after a hit and being unable to stop anything bigger than the older, smaller caliber anti-tank weapons. We'll explain that a bit better.
For those who are viewing it with me, why was the Sherman blowing up so easily? Like, one shot and it catches on fire? That typically means, like, are they able to get out of the tank in time before catching on fire? Most cases, they probably catch on fire from the inside out. Like,
in a moment. So, The British gave the Sherman a green light. But what about the American crews? Well, they would land in North Africa in late 1942
was he
with a
talking about
mix
the
of
Shermans blown
older
up too
M3
easily?
Lees and new M4 Shermans. And they'd have a completely different experience than the British. That's because the British were already experienced in fighting the Germans in the desert and were better accustomed to handling the delicate quirks of early tanks. The American crews were still green, without combat experience, and they would pay for their lessons in blood, literally. At Kasserine Pass, the inexperienced US forces fought the Germans for the first time in a serious battle. They put too much trust in their new Shermans and failed to grasp German tactics. And they were cut apart by anti-tank guns and panzers that outmaneuvered them and smashed their formations. However, those who survived would learn the lesson and come back better prepared next time. Now, both the British and Americans had enough destroyed Shermans on their hands to find out what happened to the crew inside after their tank was hit, and the results were terrifying. The first thing that was so obvious, and is still discussed today by us tank nerds, was the Sherman brewing up, or going up in flames soon after a single hit. If you're one of those nerds, you'll know...
So it was the Sherman. Okay, so I heard it correctly. The Sherman, after one single hit, gets put on fire? Like... doesn't sound too reliable there.
This had nothing to do with the gasoline engine. The problem was the ammunition, more specifically, the ammunition stowage. If you're not a nerd, here's the thing. Early Shermans stored shells for the main gun in open containers all around the tank, with most of them sitting in racks in the side sponsons. Those are the parts of the tank's hull you can see here. Not only were these shells unprotected and ready to ignite from anything hot or sparky that came through the armor, but they were also sitting in the most likely place to be hit, either from the sides or from the front. No matter the angle, a round had the biggest chance of striking the bunched up ammo in the middle of the tank. At first, they tried to solve this by welding additional armor plates over the sections where the ammo was stored, but it didn't help much. Many crews paid with their lives, or with horrific injuries.
Damn, so you just made an easy target for yourself by setting in places where it can easily get hit and then ignite? That's so crazy. Okay, I didn't know that. That's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
When their ammo ignited as they were still trying to bail out of the tank. That's how the Sherman earned those chewed over nicknames like Tommy Cooker. And another thing, although the Sherman was designed to carry around 97 shells, crews often crammed in extra rounds, afraid of running out of ammo in battle. This number could climb to as many as 140 shells stored all around the tank. The problem was solved with the introduction of wet stowage. For the non-nerds, this was a specially built stowage system with metal walls filled.
I absolutely love the extra detail and animations he's giving us now, because this is dope. Because I'm a visual learner, it's a visual representation of what it looks like. It's tough.
With a water glycol mixture that, in theory, would spill out and extinguish a fire upon penetration, or at least delay it long enough for the crew to bail out. This reduced the chances of a Sherman bursting into flames after a hit from about 70 to 80% down to around 10 to 15%. However, it said that the more important factor was the relocation of the ammo from the side sponsons down to the hull floor, where it was less likely to get hit. Whatever the case, crews were much happier. Though the wet stowage arrived too late for all those burned alive in 1942 and 1943 before it was introduced. Another disturbing thing, when you really think about it, were the hatches on early Shermans. The driver and assistant driver had above them narrow rectangular hatches, barely big enough for a human to squeeze their butts through. But this was nothing compared to the poor gunner and especially the low turret. Early Shermans had just a single two-piece hatch for all three people in the turret. Now, imagine what happened when a tank loaded with fuel and ammo was hit, filling with flames and smoke, while three people, if not killed outright, had to scramble through one narrow hatch. Look at how the crew went in. First the loader, climbing under or behind the gun breech to his position. After him went the gunner, and finally the commander. In the event of a quick evacuation, the process had to be reversed. You know, in theory. I once saw a documentary where...
Fuck! So you have less of a chance of surviving being in a tank, because the moment it gets hit, don't let you be a driver or a gunner. You're cooked, because you can't get out. You're stuck in there, burning alive in hot metal, bro. No, like, I don't know if I would I'll probably take my chances being a pilot, Air Force, because I can bail out, right? Whereas in a tank, you get hit, you have to wait for everybody else to get out. You're probably the last one to get out, and you're cooking alive, bro. You're probably burning like shit, and then don't let you take too long coming out, because they're gonna finish you off the moment you get out of there, and you're burning alive.
A Sherman veteran loader told his story. His tank was hit and the shot went through the gunner and commander, killing them both instantly. They slumped over one another while the tank quickly filled with smoke and flames. He tried to break them apart and push the bodies out of the way so he could get through, but he couldn't. After a few seconds of what must have been complete agony, he saw through the smoke a faint light coming from the driver's hatch. He was lucky the turret was traversed in a position that allowed him to reach the driver's spot, whose hatch was already open since the driver had long jumped out. He managed to abandon the tank that way. I don't know about you, but I get chills just thinking about it. From 1944, larger oval hatches were added with springs to ease the weight, and the loader finally got his own hatch, which at least slightly eased his already difficult life as a tanker. The Sherman had various ways and procedures to counter fires inside, like automatic extinguishers for the engine compartment and handheld CO2 units for the crew. But in practice, when you saw smoke and sparks inside, the only real option was to get out and as far from the tank as possible. Crews drilled evacuation regularly, learning by touch to find all the hatches so they could do it in smoke automatically and as quickly as possible. Still, it wasn't rare for a Sherman to brew up so fast that no one had a chance to escape. An interesting fact, though, is that despite the huge risks tank crews lived with and how relatively easy it was to knock out a Sherman, a US Army study between 1944 and 1945 found that about one crew member was killed per knocked out tank. The Soviets, for comparison, had a statistic for their T-34 showing that 2 tankers were killed per disabled tank. And look at this, they had double the fatality rate, despite having 4 crew members instead of the Sherman's 5. Now, before we move on to what happened to the crew inside after a hit and who was tasked with removing what was left of them, let's first look at the weapons most likely to hit a Sherman and how each one affected the crew differently. When it comes to the biggest tank killers in World War II, people usually think of the German big cats, decimating Allied armor while enemy shells harmlessly bounced off, like in the movies. But the biggest tank killers for all sides were actually anti-tank guns and mines. For the Sherman and the threats it faced, the first one was the Park 38, the German 50mm anti-tank gun, also mounted on upgraded Panzer IIIs instead of the early 37mm gun that was outdated almost as soon as the war began. The Park 38 could already knock out a Sherman without much trouble, though this became harder once Sherman frontal armor was upgraded. But then the Germans introduced the Park 40, a 75mm anti-tank gun, and this one haunted Allied tank crews for the rest of the war. It was a mean gun with very high muzzle velocity, and it was also modified and mounted on the Panzer IV in place of its early short-barreled howitzer. And then, of course, came the most terrifying one, the infamous 88. Initially used as an anti-aircraft gun, it soon became the anti-everything gun, and it was very successful at that. And German guns were much deadlier because of the nature of their rounds. You see, the Allies mostly used solid shot armor-piercing rounds. These would punch through the armor, hopefully, and cause damage by sheer force and energy. But the Germans had something called an explosive filler. This was a small, delayed action explosive charge, set to detonate milliseconds after the shell penetrated the armor. And if having a high-speed armor-piercing round going through your tank wasn't bad enough, now you also had what was basically a hand grenade exploding inside after penetration. This ignited fuel and ammunition.
No, bro, no. I could not be a tank crew, dog. You can, it's bad enough you can barely see what's happening around you. It's another thing to get hit as the bullet, torpedo, or whatever round goes through your armor and then explodes on impact. Yeah, you're cooked. Like, you're cooked. Like, most cases, in my opinion, I think the only person who would really survive a shot like that is probably the captain. Because he's not hit directly on impact unless they aim higher. You know what I'm saying? Like, the driver up front, you're probably the first one to get hit. The gunner up front, probably the first one to get hit. The reloader, maybe it just depends on how high or how, but it's also in the middle, so he's probably one of the most open shots. But then you got the captain, who's closer to exiting the vehicle, like the moment it's hit. Like, he might lose a couple legs or something.
Of course, was not good for crew's health. Then there were infantry anti-tank weapons, and the Germans had plenty of them later in the war. Panzerfaust and Panzerschrecks could ignite a Sherman in a fireball with a single hit, and were especially deadly in urban fighting. The way they affected crews was perhaps even worse than anti-tank guns. The warhead was a shaped charge, and upon contacting the Sherman's armor, it exploded and created a high-temperature jet that melted through the steel and sprayed molten metal inside over the crew, fuel, and ammo, which again was not a good way to start your day if you were a Sherman. Sherman crewmen. These weapons killed more crew members per hit tank than anti-tank guns, and because of them, you'd often see improvised armor added around Shermans, logs, sandbags, concrete, and so on, as crews tried to detonate them away from the main armor and reduce their effectiveness. Against anti-tank guns, however, these improvised protections did little to nothing. Then we have mines. Besides standard anti-tank mines that usually caused a mobility kill by blowing off a tank's tracks, sometimes they were turned into something much different. Take a look at this flipped over Sherman. It hit an anti-tank mine at Okinawa that was most likely connected to a
you can't even get out.
bomb. The explosion
there's a hatch at the
lifted
bottom of it.
30-ton tank into the air and flipped it over. It's a sad video. Here you can see the crew member who survived realizing that no one else was exiting the tank as it began to burn. Now that you understand the anti-tank weapons and how they worked, you can easily imagine how they affected the human body, although it's better if you don't. One thing the Sherman was famous for is that upon being knocked out in combat, it could relatively easily be recovered, repaired, and put back in action. But then someone had to go inside the Sherman that had been hit where some crew members, or better said what was left of them, were still inside. Sometimes
That looks like the upper half of his body, maybe, or the head or something. Like, I have to go and see, bro. Like, it looked like part of his body. He's dead. Why are y'all holding that, bro? I mean, he's trying to get it out the tank, but damn, like, oh fuck.
it was mechanics. Sometimes it was the poor guys from Graves.
This fool is half. His body's in half. You're trying to preserve I mean, again, let me stop acting like they're not trying to clean out the tank and preserve it. But shit, like, you're cooked, bro. It look like ash. Like, you look burnt alive.
Whose job was to recover and collect all the friendly bodies from the battlefield. I have to be careful what I say now, because this is YouTube and I can't get too graphic. If a Sherman's fuel and ammunition ignited and it burned out completely, the remains inside were usually charcoal, barely recognizable as what it once was. If it didn't burn, you'd have all sorts of jelly-like remains splattered inside that someone had to wash out. They would open the bottom hatch and basically flush everything out with a hose, then repaint the interior so it couldn't be recognized what had happened there before. Depending on the damage, the Sherman would either be stripped down for parts or have penetrating holes welded shut and be given another life. This went for the crews as well. During heavier battles, crews from knocked out Shermans who bailed out and survived would form new ad hoc and man the next available tank, going back into action. Some were hit more than once, in more than one Sherman during a single battle. If you're really curious to actually see the things I'm talking about, you can find them on the internet. I came across several such videos, but I don't recommend—
God dang, bro, what? I could not, dog, like, I can imagine the amount of danger tanks had to go through. Like, you think you're covered by a tank? They're unprotected because they're trapped inside, bro. Like, it's like a double-edged sword with them. You're cooked. You're really cooked. You get hit by an anti-tank gun or a bazooka, whatever that gun is right there, the Panzerfaust, or whatever that is. Come on, bro. You get hit right through it. It's either you're getting your remains getting blown up, or the tank is getting caught on fire. Like, nah, bro. You get hit once, you're cooked. Like, one hit and you're cooked. I couldn't be a tank. I couldn't be a tank infantry unit. I couldn't. I'm sorry. This is a great video though. Make sure you comment, like, subscribe, down below. This is your boy Black Finesse. We are out.